Look at the name printed on your bank card. It is older than the street it gets posted to. It is older than the road that street was built off. In many cases, it is older than the version of the language you pronounce it in, because the words it is built from were spoken in a country that had not yet decided what it was. Gaelic in the west and the north, Norse in Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides, Cumbric-speaking Britons holding on in Strathclyde, Anglian English in Lothian, and after 1124, a French-speaking Norman aristocracy invited north by a Scottish king who thought they were the future. That argument was never settled. It was written into the surnames instead. Scotland did not take hereditary surnames on the English timetable. They arrive with the reign of David I, between 1124 and 1153, carried by the Anglo-Norman and Flemish families he planted on Scottish ground. Territorial names fixed first, among men who held land and needed it written down. Gaelic patronymics stayed genuinely patronymic for centuries longer, and in parts of the Highlands and Islands did not harden into fixed surnames until the 17th and 18th centuries, which leaves an irony worth holding on to. The most Scottish-sounding names on this list are, as fixed surnames, often the youngest. The ones that sound French are frequently the oldest on paper. 15 names you can meet in a supermarket queue on a Tuesday morning in Falkirk. Count them down. Number 15, Baxter, a Baxter baked. The word comes from the Old English begestere, which began as the feminine form, the woman who baked, as opposed to the man, who was simply a baker. By the time it reaches Scottish burgh records in the 1200s, the gendering has worn off, and the Baxters of Dundee, Perth, and Edinburgh are men, gilded and extremely litigious about their rights. Bread was not a side dish. In a Scottish burgh, the Baxter held a monopoly, the town council granted, priced and policed, because bread stood between the population and hunger. The assize fixed the weight of a loaf against the price of grain, and a Baxter who cheated the weight lost the trade. Look down a Dundee class register today, and the name is everywhere. Every one of them is carrying a word that originally meant a woman. Number 14, Fletcher. From the Old French flèche, an arrow, the man who fitted the flights. Not the bowyer, who made the bow. Not the smith, who forged the head. The Fletcher did the feathers, and the feathers were the part that made the arrow go where it was pointed. The Gaelic West had its own version, Mac in a Fleischter, son of the arrow maker, which comes into English as Macleister, and then, by the usual flattening, as Fletcher. Tradition holds the Fletchers of Glenorchy were arrow makers to the chiefs of their district, though the documentation for that is later and thinner than the story suggests. Medieval Scotland ran on wool, cattle, and arrows. Only one of the three has vanished so completely that nobody can picture the workshop. The trade died out by the 1500s. The name did not notice. Number 13, Ross. From the Gaelic rose, a headland or promontory, the ground that pushes out into the water. It is a description of a coastline before it is anything else. The province of Ross in the far north took that word as its name. The earldom was established there in the 13th century. The family who held it took the province as their surname, and the surname became the clan. Be careful with the tidy version, though. Some Rosses descend instead from the Norman de Ros of Yorkshire, and the two lines have been quietly mixed in the records for centuries. Most surnames come from a job, a father, or a village. This one comes from the shape of the land where it meets the sea. Number 12, Murray. De Moravia, of Moray. Not a family, not a founder, a province. Moray had recently produced kings of its own, rivals to the line ruling from the south, and it needed holding down. So David I planted a Fleming there, a man named Freskin, around 1130, an outsider with no local loyalties and everything to gain. By the time his grandsons were signing charters, they were signing them de Moravia, as though the province had always been theirs. A century and a half later, Andrew Murray commanded alongside Wallace at Stirling Bridge on the 11th of September 1297, and died of his wounds before the year was out. The crown gave a troublesome province away to keep it quiet. The province's name walked off with the family that took it. Number 11. Douglas. From the Gaelic dub glass, dark water, black stream. There is a burn in Lanarkshire that carries the name, and it is not much of a burn. The earliest surviving mention of a man called after it is William de Duffglass, witnessing a charter around 1175. 2 centuries later, his descendants run the border as something close to a private kingdom, powerful enough that James II stabbed one of them at dinner in Stirling Castle to be rid of him. The Black Douglas was said to be the name English mothers used on children who would not settle. The rhyme survives in several versions, and none of them are contemporary, so take it as tradition rather than record. A stream nobody outside Lanarkshire could find on a map became the sound used to frighten children 200 miles away. Number 10. Lindsay. Territorial, like Ross and Douglas. But the territory is not in Scotland. Lindsay is in Lincolnshire, flat, English, drained fen country, about as far from a highland glen as ground gets. Walter de Lindesea appears among the earliest incomers under David I in the 1120s, part of that first wave given Scottish land in exchange for holding it. His descendants became Earls of Crawford and one of the great houses of the Scottish East. The name has been here 900 years. It is on war memorials, team sheets, and gravestones the length of Angus and Fife, and nobody thinks of it as an import. 9 centuries is apparently long enough. Nobody asks a Lindsay where they are from. Number 9. Fraser. And here I want to stop performing the countdown for a minute and be straight with you. The origin story attached to this name is the most repeated claim in Scottish surname literature. You will have heard it. The Frasers take their name from the French phrase, a strawberry, which is why strawberry flowers appear on their arms. A noble family from Anjou, a pun in French, the whole thing sealed and delivered. The heraldry is real. The explanation is almost certainly backwards. The flowers were adopted because the name already sounded like phrase, not the other way round, and the earliest forms, Frezel, Frizel, Frezer, do not obviously come from a strawberry at all. Where the name actually comes from is unresolved. The honest answer is that the Frasers appear in Lothian records from the middle 1100s holding land, and everything before that is guesswork. This is worth naming as a pattern, because it is the pattern. Victorian antiquarians liked tidy, flattering etymologies. They wrote them into surname dictionaries, those were copied into other dictionaries, and the internet has been reprinting them as settled fact ever since. So be skeptical, every single time, when somebody tells you with total confidence what your family name means. Ask what the document is. Ask who dated it. The confidence is usually the least reliable part. Number 8. Sinclair. De Sancto Claro, of Saint Clair. The place is Saint Clair-sur-Epte, in Normandy, a village whose main contribution to history is that a French king sat down there in 911 and handed a stretch of coast to a Viking warlord called Rollo, thereby inventing Normandy. The name is in Scotland from the 1100s. Then it does something no other name here manages. In 1379, Henry Sinclair is invested as Earl of Orkney, holding the islands not from the King of Scots, but from the King of Norway, because that is who Orkney still belonged to. His grandson began Rosslyn Chapel in 1446. The family took the earldom of Caithness in 1455 and has been in the far north since. A French name, ruling a Norse archipelago for a Scandinavian crown, out of a castle south of Edinburgh. Read it on a team sheet in Wick today, and it looks like the most local word in the building. Number 7. Graham. The receipt here is unusually clean. William de Graham holds land under David Size and witnesses the foundation charter of Holyrood Abbey in 1128, a dated document, a named man, a surviving text. The name came with him from England. It is generally taken from Grantham in Lincolnshire, which the Domesday clerks wrote down as Graham, because that is roughly what they heard. An English place name, recorded by a Norman scribe, carried north by an Anglo-Norman landholder in the 1120s. 700 years later, it belongs to Montrose, to Claverhouse, and to a stubborn slice of the Scottish military tradition. One of the most Scottish surnames alive is an English town, misspelled by a Frenchman. Number 6. Bruce. De Bruce, tradition holds from bricks in Normandy, though the identification has never been nailed down as firmly as the clan histories imply. What is documented is the land. Robert de Bruce is granted Annandale by David I around 1124, on the same terms as every other incomer. Hold the ground, keep it quiet, answer when called. 8 generations and 180 years later, on the 25th of March 1306, his descendant was crowned King of Scots at Scone, with an improvised ceremony and almost no army. 8 years after that, Bannockburn. 15 years after that he was dead, and his heart was cut out, put in a casket and carried south by James Douglas towards Jerusalem, getting as far as a battlefield in Spain in 1330 before the plan collapsed with the men carrying it. The name arrived in Scotland as a favor from a king. It left as one. Number 5. Campbell. Cambulal, crooked mouth. Not a place, not a trade, not a father, a face. Somebody in the 12th or 13th century had a mouth that sat wrong, and his neighbors mentioned it often enough that it stuck to his grandchildren. Gillispec Campbell appears on record in 1263. Caelian More, Great Colin, dies around 1296, and every chief of the name since has been styled Macaelin More, the son of Great Colin. From that face came Argyll, Inverary, the dukedom, and the largest concentration of land ever held in Scotland by one family. Campbells were on the winning side of nearly every disaster in Scottish history, which is why the name still carries a charge in parts of the country that no other surname does. The most powerful dynasty in Scotland is named after a twisted mouth. Nobody has ever established whose. Number 4. MacDonald. MacDomnall, son of Donald, and the Donald in question is Domnall, grandson of Somerled, the Norse Gaelic sea lord who died in 1164, with a fleet nobody on the west coast could match. What his descendants built was not a clan in the tourist sense, it was a state. The lords of the Isles ruled from Finlaggan on Islay, held their own council, kept their own galleys, made treaties with England behind Scotland's back, and were treated by the crown as a foreign power, with an inconvenient address. The lordship was forfeited in 1493, and the crown spent 2 centuries dealing with what it had broken. Be honest about the paperwork, though. As a fixed hereditary surname, MacDonald is younger than Bruce or Graham. The Mac form stayed a live patronymic long after the Norman names had frozen. The paper is younger, the bloodline is older. Hold that thought. Number 3. Wallace. From the Latin Wallensis, the Old French le Wallais, the Welshman. Except it does not mean Wales. In southern Scotland it meant the Britons of Strathclyde, Cumbric-speaking, Celtic, and there long before anyone else on this list. The original population, still holding the Clyde Valley while the Gaels, the Angles, and the Norse arrived to take it off them. When the word became a surname, it was a label applied from outside, marking the family as the older people in a country now run by newer ones. Richard Wallace turns up in Ayrshire in the 1170s in the following of Walter Fitzalan. A century later, one of his line commanded at Stirling Bridge on the 11th of September 1297 and was executed at Smithfield in 1305. The permanent face of Scottish independence carried a surname that meant foreigner, given to his family by people who got here after they did. Number 2. Stewart. Not a place, not a father, an office. The word is Old English stigward, the keeper of the hall, the man who ran the house while the lord was elsewhere. It passes through Norman French and lands in Scotland as a royal appointment. Around 1150, David I made Walter Fitzalan, a Breton, hereditary High Steward of Scotland. His descendants held the office so long that it stopped being a job and became who they were. In 1371, Robert Stewart took the throne as Robert II. In 1603, his descendant inherited England as well, as James VI and I, and the family spelled itself Stuart on the French model, because French has no letter W. A household job title became a family. The family became a dynasty, and the dynasty ended up ruling 3 kingdoms and losing all of them. Number 1. Dunbar. And here we step sideways out of both Scotlands, because the oldest documented surname line on this list is neither Gaelic nor Norman. It is English, and it got here first. In 1069, the north of England was in revolt, and William the Conqueror answered with the harrying, a deliberate scorched earth campaign that killed by starvation across Yorkshire and Durham. Among those it dispossessed was Gospatrick, Earl of Northumbria, who lost his earldom and went north over the Tweed with what was left of his household. De Malcolm III gave him land. In or around 1072, the lands of Dunbar on the East Lothian coast. His descendants held that ground, took its name, and became the Earls of Dunbar and March, sitting on the invasion road from England for the next 300 years. Count the dates. That is half a century before David I brought a single Norman family north. More than a century before Douglas or Fraser appear in any charter. 2 centuries before the Gaelic patronymics on this list hardened into anything a registrar would recognize. Older than the oldest standing stone in Edinburgh Castle. Older than the Declaration of Arbroath by 248 years. Older than the Bruces and the Grahams who think of themselves as the ancient ones. An exiled English earl, riding north from a burnt province with nothing, took the name of the first place that would have him. It is still in the phone book. 15 names. 15 unbroken threads, running from a burg baker weighing a loaf against the assize. A Fleming handed a province to keep it quiet. A Norman knight witnessing a charter in 1128. And an exiled earl on the East Lothian coast in 1072. All the way down to the name embossed on the card in your wallet. You did not choose it. Nobody now alive chose it. It was handed to you by someone who was handed it. And you will hand it on to someone who had no say in the matter either. Somewhere at the far end of that chain is the first one. The first man called Crooked Mouth to his face. The first family labeled foreigners in the country their ancestors had held longest. The first person to sign himself of Dunbar. That is the argument this list has been having with itself the whole way down. The French-sounding names hold the older paper, the charters, the witness lists, the dated documents. The Gaelic names hold the older blood. Scotland has never entirely stopped fighting about which of those counts as being from here. If your name is on this list, tell me where your line came in. The glen, the county, the ship, the story your grandmother told, and whether it turned out to be true or turned out to be Victorian embroidery. And if your name is not on this list, tell me which one is missing, what it means, and how far back you can actually document it.